Welcome, this is Sarah Connolly, alcohol-free lifestyle coach, and in this episode my goal is to explain the science of addiction in 30 minutes. One of the biggest challenges when we're trying to understand the science is that so many of the explanations are complicated, convoluted, and use lots of language that we don't understand. So today I'm going to try and condense all this information into a very short episode so that you can understand the fundamentals of the neuroscience of addiction. And the main reason why it's so important for us to understand this is because many influences, including the alcohol industry, understand how our brains work. And certain drugs work in very similar ways. The thing with alcohol is that it is legal. And the fact that it's legal leads us to believe the messaging that somehow we should be able to control how much we drink. The reality is that alcohol affects the brain in very similar ways to other drugs. However, you'll notice that we're not told to take cocaine or heroin in moderation. The reason why understanding the science is so important is because the people that are selling us this drug that many of us have become addicted to understand the science. So we need to be informed primarily so that we can remove any misconception that by pure willpower or moral guidance and moral code that we should be able to moderate our drinking. So let's begin with what addiction is. Basically, it's characterized by compulsive seeking of alcohol or other drugs and using that drug despite harmful consequences. Addiction, as I'm sure you're aware, affects millions of people around the world, including their families and communities. So the question is it our fault that we become addicted, or is it the fault of the people that are selling us and promoting highly toxic addictive substances? At the very heart of addiction is our brain's reward system. This system evolved originally to reinforce and encourage behaviours that are essential for our survival, things like eating and procreating. The reward system relies on a number of structures, including the nucleus accumbens, which is the pleasure centre of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, which is our decision-making part of the brain. Dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, basically a chemical messenger, is one of the primary chemicals that is involved in addiction. When we do something that we enjoy, like eating delicious food, receiving praise or affirmation, dopamine is released in the brain to create a sense of reward and pleasure. Now, the level of dopamine that's released for natural pleasures is relatively low in comparison to the level of dopamine that's released in the brain when we have a drink. So this is why certain pleasures that we may have enjoyed prior to our drinking suddenly become less appealing. When we drink alcohol, this brain reward system is essentially hijacked. What that means is that the same process works. The dopamine is released, however, it's released at a much higher level than, as an example, walking out with your dog in the sunshine or having some quality time with your children. Alcohol releases a much higher dose of dopamine, which tells the brain this is a pleasurable activity and I need to repeat it. Now, the interesting thing here is that dopamine, remember, is about survival. So when our brains get used to a certain high level of dopamine, it makes the assumption that in order to survive, we need to have that level of pleasure and reward. So in summary, the flood of dopamine reinforces our desire to repeat that behavior. And what that leads to is compulsive use of the substance and ultimately over time dependence on the substance. When we continue to drink over time, our brain adapts to this constant presence of high levels of dopamine. So ultimately we get used to it, which is why we find that over the course of months and years, we start to feel that we need more alcohol to get the same effect. This is known as tolerance. In addition to this, when we stop taking the drug, when we stop drinking alcohol, we start to experience withdrawal. This is the brain feeling like it's not getting what it needs to survive, which leads to very uncomfortable feelings such as cravings and urges that we find it very hard to resist. If we continue to drink over time, the brain's ability to rewire and adapt starts to play a very significant role in our journey towards addiction. These repeated surges of excessive dopamine can eventually cause lasting changes in the brain structure. These changes then lead to what we call a heightened sensitivity to alcohol, which makes it harder to resist cravings. Not only do we have a heightened sensitivity to the substance itself, but we also have a heightened sensitivity to the cues and triggers that make us think about drinking. This is why when we perhaps see somebody else drinking, or even if we just see a bottle of wine, our brain starts to move into craving mode, purely as a result of our high sensitivity to those cues, which can be visual, can be emotional. It may be a situation like an airport lounge. And you'll notice in many situations, you will start to feel anticipation that you are going to be able to have a drink. This is simply that chemical reaction in the brain starting to release dopamine, which says to us, you are about to experience some pleasure, and this is what you need to do in order to get it. It's also important to understand that genetics plays a significant role in our susceptibility to addiction. If we have a history in our families of alcohol use disorder, we're about 40 to 60% more likely to experience the same challenges. This is due to genetic variations that make us more vulnerable to developing addictive behaviours. When we can understand that this is, again, not a moral failing or something that we should be able to control, it can remove a lot of the shame and negative self-talk that often keeps us in the cycle of addiction. Another important brain chemical to understand is the neurotransmitter GABA. GABA is what is known as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. What that means is that it reduces or inhibits brain activity. GABA's role in our general lives is to suppress certain primitive instincts, to slow us down, to calm us down. And so when GABA is affected by alcohol, what the result is that when we drink, we can tend to slur our words, feel sedated, feel a sense of deep calm in many ways, where it can almost lead to a sense of euphoria. GABA also modulates the brain's reward system. Its role is to counteract the effect of dopamine, which is what we call the excitatory neurotransmitter, as in it's one that lifts us up. GABA has an influence on addiction through the same systems as dopamine, the brain's reward systems. When we experience something good and fun, or we receive rewards, maybe we're eating something pleasurable or we're engaging in a social interaction that we're enjoying, as we already know, the brain releases dopamine, which gives us that sense of pleasure and reward. Because, as we've mentioned earlier, that burst of dopamine is so extreme, the body, in its desire to consistently seek balance, releases GABA. The reason that it does this is to try and limit this excessive release of dopamine and keep our reward system in balance. In healthy people, this balance helps prevent excessive surges of dopamine. So basically, GABA calms us down, gives us a sense of relaxation and tranquility. And so GABA, as a good example, it plays a primary role in the drug Valium. When we drink alcohol, what happens in relation to GABA is that its effects are enhanced, which is what leads to us feeling more relaxed. This is why alcohol is known as a depressant drug, in the same way as things like Valium, as I mentioned earlier. What they do is they intensify the calming effects of GABA. When we drink to excess, the GABA activity is increased, which is what leads to tolerance, meaning that we need more alcohol to get the same effect. Dependence, meaning that we feel that we can't function without alcohol. And of course, ultimately, addiction. And ultimately, withdrawal symptoms, because our body is missing those chemicals and feels like it needs more of them. The quickest, most effective way of regaining a sense that we are back in control and that we are getting everything that we need is to have another drink. As we continue to keep drinking, the brain, in the same way that it adapts to excessive dopamine, adapts by reducing the natural production of GABA. And as a result, that leads again to us requiring more alcohol to get the same effect and leading us into that really hard to manage cycle of dependence and addiction and keeping us trapped in the roller coaster cycle of addiction. Another thing to be aware of is that GABA is very closely linked to experiences of anxiety. So if we have a deficiency in GABA activity, we're much more likely to feel anxious. When we're anxious, we turn to alcohol as a way of alleviating the symptoms. Unfortunately, this doesn't work in the long term, and it just increases our levels of anxiety, which increases our desire to drink, and so on. If anxiety is something that you suffer from, it's really important to know that whilst alcohol does relieve the symptoms in the short term, because of its impact on your neurotransmitters, it actually makes the symptoms and the experiences of anxiety worsen over time. So to summarise the role of GABA, it's quite a complicated thing to explain in under 30 minutes, but it's basically a major inhibitory chemical messenger that helps to regulate our reward system. Its role is to counteract the effects of the excitatory neurochemical dopamine. When we are drinking excessively, we are messing around with two very, very important neurochemicals. So in simple terms, one of them brings us up and the other one brings us down. And when they're working in harmony, this is how we maintain balance. This is how we stay stable, in control and calm. Unfortunately, alcohol affects both of these significantly, and especially over time with excessive consumption. This is why we find ourselves feeling very, very high and then very, very low. What's happening is what goes up must go down. And it's all to do with these chemical reactions that are happening in your brain when you put in a highly addictive and toxic substance.
Hey, James here. Just a short interruption to share with you some of the results that folks have been getting inside of our 90-day stop drinking process. This is Jessica Gaines-Jarbo from Kentucky. She says, I've now got joy, focus, presence, clarity. This is Glenn Granger from Massachusetts. I'm more patient. This is Jenny Unglis from Northern Ireland. I discovered strength I didn't know I had. This is Doug Rice from Texas. I have unbelievable clarity. This is George Bird from New York. I'm calmer. And this is Russell Belcher from Australia. My health has improved. I've lost 20 pounds, says John Keltner in California. If you would like to create these type of results, then you are welcome to apply to be part of our 90-day stop drinking process, which is called Project 90. The link is in the show notes. You can go to alcoholfreelifestyle.com/Project 90. Back to the show.
So here's a summary of how it all works together. Let's quickly consider what alcohol actually is. Alcohol is a drink that contains ethanol, and ethanol is a type of alcohol that acts as a drug. It's produced by the fermentation of grains, fruits, and other sources of sugar. Ethanol is a colorless, volatile, flammable liquid. It's also used as an industrial solvent and for fuel. When we drink alcohol, there is a very small amount of ethanol that is placed into the drink. The other ingredients are there simply to mask the actual flavor of pure alcohol, which is disgusting. I imagine. I've never tried it. But it is there for a reason. It is there to start affecting your inner brain chemistry in a way that gets you hooked so that you keep on buying it. Now, while ethanol is consumed when we drink alcohol, if we consumed ethanol alone, the likelihood is that we would fall into a coma and probably die. That's just the facts. Let's first be clear on what alcohol actually is. An alcoholic drink is a drink that contains ethanol, and ethanol is a type of alcohol that acts as a drug. It's produced by fermenting grains, fruits, and other types of sugar. It's a colorless, volatile, and highly flammable liquid, which is also used as an industrial solvent and as fuel. All alcoholic drinks contain a certain amount of ethanol, but it's important to note that when we drink alcoholic beverages, the ethanol is diluted to varying degrees. If we were to drink pure ethanol, we would either fall into a coma or we might even die. So it's really important to consider this, that when you are consuming an alcoholic drink, within that drink is a substance that would kill you if you were to drink it neat. Now, in very basic terms, when you have a glass of wine, your brain releases dopamine, which tells you this feels great. I feel amazing. I'd like some more of that. And at that point in time, your brain also is soaking up what's going on around you, the environment, where you are, who you're with. And it is storing all of that information as a memory. This is what's known as creating cues and triggers. Because you're having a pleasurable experience and you have dopamine released in your brain, which is there to remind you to do pleasurable things again, next time you're in the same environment, you will very likely feel an urge or a craving to drink. This is your brain's way of telling you that there is some reward that is imminent, and all you need to do to get that reward is have a glass of wine. At the same time, because perhaps you have a few glasses of wine on a regular basis, that one glass of wine that you have will not be enough. This is because you've started to get used to certain dopamine levels in your brain, and the effects of the alcohol are starting to wear off more quickly. When the effects wear off, we are seeking again that feeling of reward, and the chemicals are starting to drive our behavior through our reward system. And this is why it's incredibly hard not to have that second, third, fourth glass of wine. Also, we have GABA getting involved. And GABA is there to say, hold on a second, this is too much for us. We don't want to feel this high. We don't feel like this is natural. GABA comes along and starts to calm us down and make us feel more relaxed. What that also does, though, is switch off the part of the brain that is critical in terms of us making informed, considered decisions. And so GABA takes over, we're calm, we're relaxed, we're feeling good. We've, for a while there, got a really decent balance of neurochemicals. But as the effects wear off from the dopamine, the GABA takes over. And this is what makes us feel tired, sluggish, and potentially a little bit down or depressed. As these chemicals start to try and find their way back to balance, we start to feel hungover, exhausted, fed up, and disappointed in ourselves. These two chemicals are really just trying to find their way back into balance. And for an added bonus, as I mentioned before, GABA is involved in anxiety. So if you start to find that you're waking up at 3 a.m. filled with anxiety, it is a result of the fluctuating levels of neurochemicals that have been hijacked, that have been amplified through the drinking. And then when they start to wear off, these symptoms become more obvious as a result of excessive drinking. And there's more. Of course, the other effect of fiddling around with these brain chemicals is that they start to, or the impact of them, should I say, starts to affect behavior in our day-to-day life. So we're not only affected while we're drinking, there is a knock-on effect. And one of these is the impulsive behavior that starts to become more and more prevalent, not only in the times where we are drinking and trying not to but can't stop, but also in our daily lives. This is because there's been significant changes over time to the way that our brain works. Over time, we become more impulsive. We lose our natural ability to self-regulate. And what I mean by that is our ability to calm ourselves down without using an external substance. So we go through our days filled with stress and anxiety. We relieve that stress and anxiety at the end of the day with alcohol because we know that it works and because our brain systems have been hijacked and we can see it as the only answer to those feelings of discomfort, stress, anxiety at the end of the day. Now that we know all of this, I'd like to just take a moment to ask you or invite you to think about how much of this is actually your fault. When you really consider how clever this drug is, this drug actually hijacks your brain, unbeknownst to you, especially in the early days, because we're not taught about all of this stuff, that this substance can actually start to have an impact on how you think, feel, and behave. And over time, it gets worse and we become more dependent, and our ability to step back and notice with clarity what's going on is severely impaired. That's why it becomes so hard for us when we think about the possibility of removing alcohol. We have become incredibly reliant on these systems working in a certain way. Our brain believes that we need to drink in order to survive challenging situations. Our brain believes that we need alcohol in order to have fun because it's used to excessive surges of dopamine that are unnatural. Our brain believes that we need to drink. The good news is that if our brains are capable of doing this, they're also capable of doing the opposite. But we need to step in and take over the role that alcohol has been playing in our lives. We need to realize that our brain has been held hostage, and it's now our responsibility to free it from the grips of this hijacker. How do we do this? Well, let me say that, of course, if it was easy, most people would probably not drink. And the reality is it isn't easy because we are fighting a substance that has incredible power. It has such a hold over us because it manages to infiltrate our systems and create new experiences that really we're not meant to have. We're not meant to feel that high, and we're not meant to feel that low through the use of an addictive substance. The only way that we can start to free ourselves, free our brains, is to work on creating in a natural way the feelings and sensations that we got from our drinking. One of those is the natural ability to self-soothe or self-regulate. What that means is that we need to learn how to manage our stressful situations and our anxiety without drinking. This takes time and patience, but once we remove the alcohol, because as I said, the brain is incredibly smart and has the capacity to adapt and change. Once we remove alcohol, it gives our brains a chance to come back into balance and allow us to do all the things in the natural way. So we need to learn to calm ourselves down and self-soothe. It's important as well to remember, though, that our brains have been used to doing things a certain way for potentially a very long time. Our brains are used to having alcohol in them for 10, 20, 30, 40, maybe more. So we need to accept that our efforts to create change need to be coupled with some patience and self-compassion. We have not fallen into the alcohol trap because we are weak. We have fallen into the alcohol trap because alcohol is a substance that hijacks our brain's system. We have fallen into the trap because alcohol is a substance that hijacks key brain systems, primarily the reward-seeking system. And for us to believe that we should be able to control this is unrealistic. The only way that we can take control is by removing the very substance that we've been relying on for so long and find ways of achieving the same effect through natural, healthier, more sustainable options. Now, I say the same effect because what happens is once your brain heals and gets used to the levels of brain chemicals that are natural and normal, you will start to feel the same things that you felt when you were drinking. The only difference, really, in my experience, is that you will start to become more and more aware of those feelings and more discerning about which feelings you want more of and which feelings you want less of. Ultimately, as you become alcohol-free and get control of your brain, you have control of your life. You can decide consciously what it is that needs to be done in order to increase your dopamine in a natural way. You can choose those times when you're stressed and overwhelmed, and you can make a choice about how you want to manage that. You can take charge. You can free the hostage that is your brain. You can become more conscious of those times when you're starting to feel stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed. And you can take control here by doing practices and things that relieve your stress and anxiety in a natural and sustainable and healthy way. So to wrap this episode up, I hope that you now have an understanding of just how powerful this substance is when it comes to how it affects key parts of your brain. It is not a simple matter of willpower. The only way to address this situation from a science perspective is to stop drinking. It's also the way to address the problem from a how we free our brains and our minds from alcohol is to simply stop drinking. I know that's not easy, and maybe it isn't simple, but it's much better than the complex things that you are doing to your mind by adding in a substance that literally takes over. Once you reach a certain point with your drinking, it is highly possible that your brain systems will be permanently damaged. And at that point, it becomes harder and harder to take back control. The earlier we take control and step in and intervene, the better. And the great news is, because of neuroplasticity, we can change the brain, we can heal the brain. but we must stop putting a substance into our bodies that consistently, relentlessly hijacks our brain chemistry and causes us to feel like we are somehow weak and flawed and that it's all our fault, which perpetuates the cycle and keeps us drinking. You can take control. You can change your brain. And there are a multitude of tools to help you to do that. Some of those tools are available in the notes below. There's lots of free resources, or you can join a support program which is designed to fundamentally change your brain back to the way that it's supposed. Thank you for listening. This is Sarah Connolly for the Alcohol-Free Lifestyle podcast.
Hi there, this is James Swanwick. Thank you so much for listening to the show. I would be so grateful if you would leave a review. That will help us climb the rankings and get our show exposed to so many more people who could really benefit from the content. You can do that by going into Apple Podcasts, rating the show, writing a little one-sentence summary, and posting it. That would be so amazing. Thank you. Likewise, if you would like to schedule a 15-minute exploratory call and apply for our Project 90 program, then you can do so by going to alcoholfreelifestyle.com/project90. If you'd like to get the free guide, that is the Alcohol Freedom Formula Guide, you can go to alcoholfreelifestyle.com/guide. Our YouTube channel is at alcoholfreelifestyle.com/YouTube. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at James Swanwick. Thank you so much for listening. We so appreciate you, and we'll catch you on the next one.